I would like to throw out initially a few ideas for us to think about as the course of the discussion takes place. As we know, the security architecture for much of our lives, and there are some of you much younger than I am, was determined in the aftermath of World War II. And we had many institutions created, extraordinary ones that we should never forget kept world peace all these years. For my entire life, there has not been a world war, and I'm very grateful to my ancestors, my father and his generation, which many Americans call the greatest generation, for not only winning World War II, but providing for a safe world for at least 2 generations beyond them. These institutions, though, I have to question. We talk about good governance, and we talk about institutions for nation states and how important it is. But what about the institutions for the global environment or the regional environment? Are they really suitable for this changing world? Again, Adam will talk about this in relation to the global security environment. I would like to throw out a few other ideas. Are these institutions, almost all of them created after World War II, to deal with the global financial situation and the global economic situation? Are they the right institutions? I think we're finding out that the answer to that is no. We see how, in particular, Europe, the United States, and other countries are trying to cope with a financial situation which presents challenges that we have not had to face since the 1930s. The institutions that we seem to have today are not adequate. Are they also adequate for providing for the development needs of so many countries? Ambassador Fahmy will be focusing particularly on the Arab Spring countries, and I'm sure he's going to give us a new title for that. But are the development institutions, the trade investment institutions, adequate? And I talked a little bit about that myself too. But there are other challenges. Are the institutions of today capable of dealing with Iran? Is this multipolar world capable of dealing with Iran? And are we prepared for dealing with a nuclear Iran, a nuclear Saudi Arabia, a nuclear Turkey, a nuclear Egypt? Well, these are important questions. And what about the tactical use of nuclear weapons? This is something that is actually being contemplated by a number of countries. How are we to deal with that? Beyond that, we need to keep in mind that the world is changing because of demographics. We now have over 7 billion of us living in this world. And the growth is not evenly divided. China, because of 2 generations of a one-child policy, is going to face a severe crisis, also because they have too many males and not enough females. But a China, which we often talk about as being a strong engine of growth, is going to slow down because of the lack of children and so many adults. 1 child has to support 2 parents and 4 grandparents. That's a lot of pressure on that 1 child. Same as Japan is losing population, as is some countries in Europe. The United States would be losing population, except that we welcome immigrants, and because of that we still have a very vibrant population distribution. But demographics is very important in trying to understand the world, and the Arab Spring countries are among those that lead the world in terms of population growth, and their expectations are very high. What about the environment and climate change? Are the institutions that we have today capable of dealing with that? And then there are new challenges that no one even thought about 5 years ago, like cybersecurity. Cyber warfare is a fact of warfare today. It's happening every single day. And for those of you with cell phones, someone's probably listening to everything you say. someone somewhere. And cybersecurity is now factored into every battle that is fought. And that is, we have no institutions to deal with that. So I throw out all of these ideas, and I don't expect that we will have the answers, but I think a group like this can help shape and inform the debate that needs to go on about institutions, about priorities, and about the changing global environment that we are all facing today. This is very, very deep and very heavy stuff, and I think it's absolutely appropriate that a group like this try to come to grips with these issues. And after the comments that we hear today from our distinguished panelists, look forward to hearing the comments and the questions that you have. Thank you very much. Ambassador Fahmy?
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much, and good morning. I will try to focus on the changing global systems from the perspective of the Arab Spring and what the Arab Spring means to all this. Adam's an expert on global affairs, so that way we can sort of share the time efficiently for all of you. As Jim said, I mean, I'm not a particularly strong supporter of the term Arab Spring. Nevertheless, I don't fight battles I can't win unless they're on principle. And that's what the press is calling it. I accept the metaphor. It's I believe, a good beginning. And one thing that's common in spring is that the weather is never really very stable. You have good weather one day, rain the other day, and depending on where you are, rain can be good and rain can be bad. The reason why I hesitate about the spring is not because spring in the Middle East ends and therefore we have long hot summers, although I've coined that phrase occasionally also. It's more because it's short, and this process is going to take time. I see it as a positive process, but it's going to take time, and it's, as Egyptians are essentially farmers, this is when you plant the seeds, and the seeds take time to nurture, and that's really where we are. My preference would have been Arab awakening, but anyway, it's the Arab Spring for all practical purposes, and it's complicated, and it's going to go through not one, but 4, probably 8, maybe 12 seasons before one can see whether it's going to work or not. But anyway, the most important point for all of us here is it's changed. It's changed a lot of the parameters, a lot of the points that we all took, and particularly developed countries took as a given. And when they did that, they were actually blind to what was happening anyway, because they kept believing nothing has changed, and things had changed. If I look at my 37 years in diplomacy, I would never have imagined any one of 10, 15 global changes that I can name to you. The implosion of the Soviet Union, the tearing down the Berlin Wall, the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, the creation of new states, and so on and so forth. In the last 10 years in the Arab world, with the exception of probably 2 or 3, maximum 4, every single Arab leader has changed. You can't assume there hasn't been changes because we keep saying there hasn't been change. So change has been ongoing. Now, however, it is societal change, and that's really the big difference. Let me address the point first, why. I argue there are 3 reasons. Most of all, the issue that Jim just mentioned, demographics. If I take my country, because I can speak to it without being criticized, at least by other countries, but there are a lot of Egyptians here, so they can feel free to criticize me. But anyway, 56% of our population is 25 years and younger. A quarter of the Middle East lives in Egypt. So I'm a mathematician by education. Believe me, the average in the Middle East won't be less than 50%. So you have half of the region, 25 years and younger. What happened over the last 25 years in the Middle East? With all due respect, some of the Egyptians don't even remember former Egyptian presidents, and they don't relate to them. No Egyptian of that age has ever been at war with anybody. was a completely different mindset from what it was in the past. Add to it communications. When I was growing up, to communicate, you'd have to watch one of 3 television stations or travel, and of course radio. Today they communicate virtually all over the world in their bedrooms. Besides, of course, nobody has the restrictions on travel which we had in the past. That affects how this youth think, how the population thinks, what they expect of their governments, and how and when they hold their governments accountable. Now, a third issue, of course, is in the Arab world there were problems of good governance. That's the common thread throughout the Arab world. Why the spring is occurring there rather than in Latin America at this point in time. It happened there earlier. So there was this common problem of good governance. Now, the differences will then exist between a rich Arab country, a poor Arab country, a monarchy or a republic, how far reform has occurred here or there. Differences may exist. But in essence, what's common here is a very youthful population, a population that is connected throughout the world, and a common problem of good governance. Now, what has actually changed? I mentioned just a second ago, even before the Arab Spring, over the last 10 years, most of the Arab leaders have changed. And since then, the remaining ones. Secondly, because of the youthfulness and the communications, how Arabs identify themselves has changed. In the past, it was, at least when I was growing up, was pan-Arabism. We're all Arab and that's it. We still consider ourselves to be Arab, and I am an Arab. But the average Egyptian Arab today is Egyptian Arab. He's interested in the IT sector in India or in China, watching Hollywood in the States. His interest, in other words, what he is different from my interest in the past. And therefore you have this issue of defining a new identity in the Arab world. Now that has caused challenges between the conservative trends in society and the more open, progressive trends in society, and that's again one of the issues where we're discussing now. Where is the role of religion and the role of do you have liberal, progressive parties, and so on and so forth. So, and the whole issue of fundamentalism and the sort. The third issue is a new social contract. If you look at what's happening today, what are Arabs asking for from their own governments? They want to have access to information. They want to be able to participate in decision making. They want to be able to hold their government accountable. And ultimately, they want to be able to compete in the process, the political process of change. All of that, by the way, and I'm taking politics as the example, but if you apply the same thing, I mean, and you can very easily, I mean, what's happened since January 25th in Egypt, it's not only the political activists who are demonstrating. Everybody's demonstrating against authority, whether it is in private business, in the public sector, in politics, at home. I mean, you can't get an argument, you can't get anything done without a long discussion. So there is this new social contract being developed in Arab societies, even in personal issues and personal life. And I mentioned this, it may not appear very relevant to a discussion about security networks, but actually the reason I mention it is because you've missed it for so long and you need to take that into account in the future. What's going to happen because of this is, and this is what comes more to your topics, the political systems in the Arab world will change. Why is it that you have a debate on reform in Morocco, and they moved quite progressively, particularly on women's rights a number of years ago, revolutions in Tunis, Libya, Egypt, and a discussion about the role of women in Saudi Arabia, all at the same time. The winds of change are affecting all of these societies, but the results will come out differently. Professor Aras in the opening session made an interesting point that I want to actually use, and I'll plagiar with the risk of losing my academic integrity here. He suggested the breakdown of hegemonies. I agree with him. That's one of the new issues that we're witnessing internationally. But I would actually apply that even domestically. The hegemony of authority has broken down. The central authority no longer really is as effective as it was in the past. Be that government, be that the owner of a enterprise, or so on and so forth. And again, you see this. The relationship, for example, between the military council since the revolutions occurred in Egypt and the street is a very interesting example of this. The military council took a marvelous position during the demonstration itself. Nevertheless, the street has continued to question it, and there's been this continuous pull and push process. Sometimes it comes out with very good results, sometimes the results aren't that good. But again, the idea that there is one authority doesn't exist any longer. The street considers themselves to be the authority, and the council is the authority. Now we're going to put together a government in a couple of days, and they will be the authority. Parliament claims that they are the authority. There is no hegemony of authority any longer. Now, we don't want to have a chaos either, but we have to find a balance here. Jim also mentioned an issue which was interesting: the multitude of stakeholders. I gave you just a few. He mentioned a couple of others in his introduction. But yes, I mean, in the new Middle East, the new Arab world, the Islamists will have a more legitimate, more open, more active political role. Whether they get a majority or not, and in which country is not the point. But there is a multitude of stakeholders. We all have to get used to dealing with that. And I say we, and I mean we in the Middle East, but you will have to also get used to dealing with us in the same way we got used to dealing with you, because you had multi-stakeholders. Now, if you look at how this affects the systems of politics and the systems that relate to security in the Middle East, there's no clear definition. And anybody who tells you that it's going to affect it A to H or H to Z is just frankly making it up, because we have never had this paradigm before, and there's no real empirical evidence to say when ABC happened, this is the result that occurred in the past. But the challenges that we're facing is the whole question, for example, of regionalism. What is the region? Is the Arab world with multi-stakeholders in this new system going to be the same Arab world that was led earlier on by Nasser pushing decolonization issues? And by the way, the first regional organization in the world was the Arab League, just to set the record straight on this. With so many voices speaking out, will the region be able to speak as one region? Or will it speak as sub-regions? And you've seen over the last 20 years, sub-regional organizations, some successful, some not, from Marrakesh, from the Maghreb Arabi, all the way to the GCC, sort of developing, and others that failed, including some that my country was in a preliminary basis part of. But again, so this issue of what actually is the region. I remember at one point when I was in Washington, President Bush suggested that we look at the greater Middle East. And I was shocked at that time. We can't even solve our own problems in our own Middle East, and we sort of wanted to expand it further. But again, who is the region is an important issue to look at this. What actually is the role of monarchies and republics? Is that going to be the defining factor? There's a simplistic discussion going around that the problem is with the republics, not with the monarchies. So let's just sort of put all the monarchies together. I have tremendous respect for monarchies where they've succeeded, but I think this argument is really a silly argument. And I see change happening in all of these countries, and if monarchies do it better than republics, I raise my hat to them and I applaud them. And I think, but this issue again, how are we going to divide the region? On what intellectual basis are we going to divide the region? Is it going to be on the basis of nationalism? On the basis of religion? What is going to be the overriding theme? I mentioned Nasser, it was pan-Arabism. It was basically nationalism. People are arguing now that, well, maybe the common factor is Islam, especially with the results that are coming out in different countries throughout the Middle East, with an increasing emergence of an Islamic political system, political parties. All of these questions will come up. Some of you will conclude, therefore, that, well, the system is breaking down, so what comes in its place is necessarily negative. My argument is the system hasn't been working for a number of years, and if it's not working, it's time to fix it. And it's too early to say whether the results will be negative or positive, because if you look at all of the questions I just raised and applied them around the world, you will see in some parts of the world regional organizations working, and others where they haven't worked, and you've had sub-regional organizations working better. You've had countries where religion was important or paramount that became democracies. Indonesia is a functioning democracy, and others where it did not work. So again, drawing easy conclusions that this is going to work or it's not going to work, I think I'd warn against. What I can assure you is going to happen, and that's the only thing I'm going to assert with any sense of confidence, is this is going to be an interactive system. It's not going to be a system where, in the Arab Middle East, definitely not in Egypt, where one leader will be able to give you the full authority of decision-making without responding to his people for any length of time. It may happen in short periods of time, but you're going to have to factor in your political and security analysis variables that didn't exist in the past. As you factor in these variables, you will, again, the initial reaction will be, this is becoming a less secure region. I actually argue that, and I'll touch on this in a second, if you factor in enough variables, it becomes a more secure system rather than a less secure system, because no one single factor is the dominant factor, and therefore the presence or the absence of that factor doesn't change the situation in the long term. In other words, if the leader is removed or dies or changes, the whole system doesn't break down. What's going to happen if you have no hegemony of authority, if you have more stakeholders, if you have a more interactive system? First thing you're going to happen is more short-term politics. Any system in the Middle East, including my own country, any elected president, elected parliament, will have to take into account short-term politics much more than we had to take that into account in the past. The challenge we will face is how do you ensure that your strategic interests are preserved and you handle short-term politics. On occasion, you may see that there's a contradiction between the two, but that's not necessarily the case all the time. And I've had to work, well, had the honor to work in different foreign countries as a diplomat, and I witnessed how they took into account their strategic interests, and at the same time, I had to suffer the consequences frequently of short-term politics. Now, as much as it is annoying on a case-by-case basis, on the long term, because of the checks and balances between short-term interests and long-term strategic interests, it's easier to read into a democratic system the future than it is in a non-democratic system. Now, I don't want to give the impression that I'm arguing here that there is a clear distinction between short-term and long-term politics. if you ignore short-term politics long enough, they will ultimately start eroding in the strategic long-term positions you take. So I'm arguing that take into account short-term politics in the Middle East, because while the strategic objectives will not shift quickly, they will create, the short-term politics will create a different environment where strategic positions may shift gradually. So that's another reason why to take into account what's happening in the immediate political arena. What do I see as a result of all this? And here I'm really out on the limb. First of all, I believe Arabs will become more individualistic and more nationalistic at the same time. They will argue their personal interests, but I see this increased activism, the desire to speak out, the desire to participate, as it reflects into foreign policy. I actually see a more active, and I believe will be more constructive, a more active, more nationalistic Arab world vis-a-vis the world. I have argued for decades that we need to speak out on international issues more vocally, not only on the issues that relate to our region. If Arabs start talking to their own authorities about everything from the Arab-Israeli peace process to human rights provisions, to whether or not they want to accept abortion, you will hear that voice also in the positions taken by Arab governments in the international arena. And of course that will also apply to security arrangements and relationships and the sorts. You will see a more aggressive Arab position on double standards. Where and when double standards exist, governments will be held, Arab governments will be held accountable by their people. And as they're held accountable by their people, they will become more aggressive in responding to these double standards internationally. Again, it may create some worries for some. If it does, because you're applying double standards, I'm happy for your worries. Doesn't bother me, but I actually think that because we will speak out more constructively, more aggressively on double standards, ultimately this helps the political game. It doesn't allow double standards to continue for too long. It allows all the stakeholders to argue that you can't continue too long in these double standards without paying a price for it. And it actually ultimately leads to a stronger position for the centrists, be they in the Arab world or in the international arena, who are pushing for centrist moderate solutions. So as much as this may lead to more frequent arguments between friends in the short term, I think there'll be less significant arguments, and they will be ultimately more useful in ensuring that stability is prevailed. I would also argue that given this kind of process, and I'll try to wrap up with some examples, given this kind of process, when agreements are reached, they will be truly representative of what the majority of the people in the region actually believe in and what they support. Now, leaders will always have to be leaders and be ahead of the curve, but ultimately, I don't believe you will find situations where leaders sign agreements that the constituencies won't join in a reasonably short period of time. So this, again, this argument that I've heard for years is that, well, this is signed with Egypt or Sadat, but it's not what happens with Mubarak, or now that Mubarak is left, what happens post-Mubarak. Agreements will be agreements, whether you like them or not. They're part of the establishment, and the overwhelming majority of the country will be supporting of that. Now, how does that actually apply? And I will close in 5 minutes very quickly. if I was to look at the Middle East, and I'm looking mostly at the Arab Middle East, and since I'm an academic, I can do this without tremendous risk. I think that the Maghreb countries, the Arab Maghreb countries, will continue to be committed to their Arab origins, see a more Islamist flavor in their politics. At the same time, focus more seriously on Mediterranean, focus more on Mediterranean and European relations. And I actually think if this happens, and there is a response to it, it serves both the Maghreb countries and the European countries. If I look at the center of the Arab world and the Mashriq, in other words, Egypt and all the way to the Mashriq, as we get through our reform process, the most prominent issue will continue to be the Arab-Israeli conflict. The most prominent political issue, foreign policy issue, will be the Arab-Israeli issue, and primarily, but not solely, the Palestinian issue. I honestly believe that the two-state solution remains the best option between Palestine and Israel, and it is the most widely supported option in the short term. But I'm worried in the long term that if this isn't resolved, you will see a lot more frustration and anger. It was mentioned yesterday that Arab revolutions were about dignity. That's correct. What's happening to the Palestinians is looked at as not only a usurpation of their rights, but it's also looked at something that is a undignified situation for the Arab world as a whole. So I see this as becoming a prominent issue. Now, will that lead, because this is sort of the question that comes up frequently, will that lead to abrogation of treaties between peace treaties, Egypt, Jordan, between Egypt and Israel? I don't think it will lead to that anywhere in the short term. And I think, frankly, whether that happens or not will not be a function of the Arab Spring, but more of a function of what are we actually trying to build a comprehensive peace as was originally outlined or not. It will be more difficult to manage, yes, in the absence of a serious peace process. But this was, the Arab-Israeli peace agreements were signed as part of a comprehensive peace program, or at least a project, and they were based on a calculation of self-interest as well. That will continue to be the case, and I think, frankly, open democratic societies will continue to do that. So the threat to Arab-Israeli peace is not Arab Spring, it's stagnation. If we don't move forward, because we're worried about the variables, the pressures actually increase. If we do move forward, I think you will see a receptive Arab society. Again, and that's why I mentioned at this point at the beginning, half of the Egyptian population have never been at war with anybody, including Israel. So for their perspective, war is the except. When I was 25, and I'm fudging it by 2 years here, Egypt had gone through 4 wars in my first 25 years. So being at war with Israel was a common issue. My son has never witnessed an Arab-Israeli war, and he's 28. So their perspective is not, we want to go to war with Israel. That's not what's out there. But they want to preserve their rights and their dignity and so on. Relations with the U.S. With multi-stakeholders, you will have different voices about relations with foreign countries, Europe, U.S., the Russians, and so on. Anybody who calculates the pros and the cons of this will understand that the U.S. will continue to play a very important role economically and politically and militarily for decades to come. And I see that relations with the U.S. will be will still be a primary objective. They will not be the same, however, because they will have more checks and balances. But I don't see an anti-American sentiment developing as a result of Arab reform. There'll be some tough love from both sides, Arab, US, but ultimately, as long as tough is the adjective and love is the operative, that's fine on my side. One thing I'd like to throw out here is I actually believe that as we have more stakeholders and we look at the world and also having more stakeholders, you will see a larger Asian dimension in Arab politics. Be that from, not that much from the west of the Arab world, but starting from the center and definitely into the Gulf. Not replacing the US. The US at this point is irreplaceable in the Arab world at least. But I see a larger Asian dimension, be that because of trade issues, be that because of energy issues, or be that simply because a desire to balance, well, also be that because of demographic reasons, by the way, in the Arab Gulf in particular. But economic and trade investment, and a desire to sort of have a multi-stake relationship with the world. My conclusions, therefore, is please try to understand the Arab Street. When I used the word Arab Street in the past, in the West, in the best of circumstances, I get a smile. Most of the time, we completely ignore it. I'm not surprised you were surprised about what happened in the Arab world. We were surprised. So I'm not claiming that you were not, that there's no reason for you to be surprised. But it's serious now. If you really want to understand what's happening, you need to understand the trends, the political, social, and economic trends that are occurring in the Arab Street, because they will be players in short-term politics, and that long-term will affect strategic politics. Don't allow yourself to, don't box yourself in by saying there are so many variables out there, let's do nothing. Because then you lose an opportunity to actually affect the process. Now, Arabs will have to define how to develop their political systems. But I definitely believe that whether it's by economic support, whether it's by political engagement, security relations, the international community does have an influence on what we do with our new political systems. If you decide, I'm not going to engage because there are so many variables, well, somebody else will engage. Or forces that you may not like very much will engage. So I encourage you to engage, and I say this with self-interest as an Arab, because I argue also that Arabs need to be outgoing and engage with the world. Last point that I'm going to close with, and respond to Jim's question, will we have to develop new institutions? First answer is yes, of course. I've actually been asked to join an Arab League commission on how to revitalize the Arab League, how does it deal with the new Arab world, and so on and so forth. So the Arab League is actually looking at that. But while we actually reform existing institutions, we have to look at new institutions as well, which may not exist at all. Now, to try to do that in the Middle East, you always bump into the Arab-Israeli issue. And it's very, as much as I'd like to see a Middle Eastern security and cooperation organization, and we tried that in the ACRES process in the past, we discussed it. You ended up with, okay, how do we deal with Israel and the Arab world in the absence of peace? The same applies to all of the efforts we tried vis-a-vis the 5 working groups that emanated from the Madrid peace process. They went up to a point, and in some cases they went further. The Water Corporation went further. There were some issues on environment that went further. But if you don't deal with some of the political problems that are there, this will be a continuous obstacle in trying to develop functioning political, new political institutions. The one point that I'd like, and I encourage that we do, but I'm just saying that as we try to do this, we will face these problems, and you have to deal with these problems. One last point I'd like to throw out is, for us to succeed in the Middle East, or for us to succeed as a global community, we need to move from the post-World War II logic of security, which was a balance of power, to a post-globalization or a globalization concept of security, and this covers all of the issues that Jim mentioned, which is a balance of interests. Nobody can define power the same way it was defined in the past, which was mostly military and occasionally economic. You add to it now information, you add to it communications, you add to it this or that. I mean, and who actually is the player? Is it the nation? Is it the nation state or an individual? So we need to move more and more towards a security system based on a balance of interest, and which will ultimately be interpreted through what exists in the UN in the past, a collective security system. I'd like to stop at that point, and Adam, I'm sorry I took so long, but thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I was encouraged to make some observations about the global roles of the United States, Europe, and to touch on some of the implications of the rise of Asia. So, starting with the United States then, I think it's fairly clear that under the pressure of increasing resource constraints and also the wider strategic strains imposed by a perceived overextension, the US is now undergoing a significant adjustment in its global posture. And I think this is something that involves both retrenchment and recalibration. The retrenchment is intended essentially to conserve and to consolidate American strengths and power. The purpose, if you like, is to bring about a set of circumstances that make the US a sustainable superpower. Now, one element of this, of course, involves disentanglement from the large-scale interventions of the post-9/11 period, and indeed the drawdown from Iraq to a more residual engagement has virtually now been completed, and the US presence there in any case will be much lighter than perhaps initially intended, because that is the preference of the Iraqi government. In Afghanistan, the US has completed a surge that was always intended really to speed the timetable for extraction. And the timetable for withdrawal by 2014-15 is now fixed and firm, and it seems to me irreversible. The retrenchment here has also involved an implicit shift from a radically transformative agenda and objective for Afghanistan, I think, to one of essentially managing and mitigating risks to the US and its wider allies that may emerge post-2015 from Afghanistan. The process of retrenchment doesn't, however, just involve disentanglement, but obviously also a much more cautious and calculated approach to entanglement in the first place. It seems likely that going forward the US will exercise much more discretion and caution in its global commitments, and its engagements will be much more selective, because that is, as I indicated, what interests and what resources demand. The US will be something that could be thought of as a discretionary superpower. It'll be strategically less ubiquitous, and it'll have a narrower strategic bandwidth than it did at the height of the Cold War or during the supposed unipolar episode that followed the Cold War. It'll be a superpower when and where it chooses to be. In this sense, I think the emerging US global posture is in no way to be confused with isolationism, which is in any case perhaps an exaggerated inflection in US strategic thought in any case. Now, I think it follows from this more discretionary US attitude towards global engagements that more obligations will be imposed on US regional partners to act for themselves, to make much greater provision for their own security, and to take on the burdens that this implies. These partners will no longer simply be able to assume US leadership, even though they can count on US support. And I think here, obviously, the recent case of Libya is very instructive. Washington's calculus was that its interests in Libya were less engaged than those of its European allies, whom it in turn expected to take the lead in the campaign against the Gaddafi forces. The US acted as something that could be thought of as a kind of lender of last strategic resort in the provision of intelligence, of material, and other resources. But it notably resisted the temptation to take formal charge. Now, this leadership role that was conferred on Europe did gratify a number of European egos, it has to be said, but it was more significant for being a little bit of a wake-up call, or actually not so little a wake-up call, but a rather big one, about the fact that the terms of trade in the European-American relationship are undergoing a secular readjustment of long-term significance. And as with Europe, so elsewhere, it seems to me that the US will in future be looking for all of its existing allies to do more for themselves. It'll be seeking out new partners to help advance US goals, and it'll try to work wherever possible with regional powers on the possible construction of a kind of division of labor for systemic management. The hard-headed, very realist attitudes that are central, I think, to this emerging US posture has, I think, notably been on show in what I also would like to think of America's response to the Arab awakening rather than the spring. As I mentioned, it declined leading in the Libyan effort. It was willing to drop a long-standing ally in the shape of Mubarak and then to try to ride the revolutionary wave, but it's also maintained a very strong geopolitical solidarity with a set of much more conservative, perhaps even counter-revolutionary regional regimes centered on Saudi Arabia because of their importance to the containment and the deterrence of Iran. I think that's an impressive strategic flexibility. So much then for the pattern of retrenchment. The recalibration, I think, entails a shift in strategic attention away from Europe and from Central Asia to a continuing concern for the Gulf and the Middle East, and a much greater emphasis on the Asia-Pacific as the main global strategic theater. Whatever strategic savings in former areas of interests the US can make will help to subsidize, I think, a recommitment to Asia, which is the world's most vibrant economic region, the one most strewn with implicit conflicts in which the US may become involved, and of course the locus of those powers that seem most likely to abbreviate American paramountcy or to challenge it in some way. More of that later. It's ironic then that just as the US is turning to Europe to do more, Europe is of course embroiled in a deep economic crisis that it means it can do less. That crisis hasn't played itself out. Its effects are still unfolding and could be dramatic. Defense spending, of course, is going to come under even more pressure than it usually is, but I think the strategic ramifications of what we're seeing in Europe are going to be rather wider. At a minimum, there's going to be a prolonged period of introspection and introversion in Europe, a turning inward. Europe's coherence as an actor on the global stage will be, I think, sharply reduced, at least for an interval, since the whole European project and whole European structure is being questioned now. Fragmentation of the Eurozone, which is still seen by many people as a distinct possibility, would simply have the effect of compounding already deep political divisions within Europe. The European institution building, enlargement and integration processes were in part, of course, deliberately conceived as an effort to pool European capabilities and power and resources as a means to deal more effectively with challenges on the global scale, not least in framing relations with major powers that are rising or to some extent have already risen. But as that whole process now stalls, the ambition to play that role, to play at that level, will of course come under much more stress. And it's likely, it seems to me, that the more provincial, more parochial attitudes of many EU member states, as against, for instance, the more expeditionary, if you want to put it that way, mindset of the French and the British, will reassert themselves. I think it's obvious that the crisis has also diminished Europe's magnetism and attractiveness to others, on which much of its putative soft power has rested. Its ability, in other words, to prompt or to require social, economic, and political changes of neighboring countries seeking to join the EU or to somehow come into closer association with it. Europe's capacity for enlargement and its capacity to absorb other major states in its membership and its capacity for further integration would seem to have been exhausted for the time being, and I think that does carry big strategic consequences. I think Europe doesn't have much of a choice but to interest itself in developments in its Russian, Balkan, Eurasian and Mediterranean neighborhood, but at issue is whether it can really summon the coherence and the capacity to define and then to achieve objectives that it could set for itself. And of course an early test here will be the role it plays in the very complex and crucial transitions that we've been hearing about in North Africa, where in essence, in some cases, a big state-building process has to be attempted. And meanwhile, I doubt personally whether Europe will be able, in the short to medium term, to organize itself for a serious engagement with Asia. That has serious implications in its own right, but I think clearly a Europe which fails that particular test is also going to be of diminishing interest to the United States, for whom, as I mentioned, Asia is where the action is going to be and where it will seek to import help from others in pursuing its own interests. Turning then to the rise of Asia, I think in global terms, of course, its rise is a fact, and I think it's going to involve essentially dislocating and disruptive effects, at least in the short to medium term. I think it's important to understand that the rise of Asia doesn't automatically or axiomatically entail the rise of Asian global leadership or the assumption of any kind of custodianship of international norms and institutions, of contributions to the preservation of global public goods, and so on. It's important when looking at Asia to understand that at its heart there is a very significant paradox. Outwardly, in economic terms, it displays all of the features of a modern globalized world economy. It's integrated, it's webbed, there's very intensive flows of people, ideas, capital, trade, and so on. But if you turn away from that and look at it from a geopolitical perspective, what you see is something which is deeply fragmented and implicitly conflictual. The Asia-Pacific, to begin with, is better thought of in any case as a collection of rather discrepant sub-regions with different dynamics and characteristics, interests and priorities. It's also important to remember in respect of Asia that there isn't just a redistribution of power to Asia, but there's a redistribution of power going on within Asia, so that its main characteristic or its main feature is one of flux and instability. And I think it does have to be understood as a region which is avowedly multipolar with all of the complexities and intricacies that implies, and it's operating, I think, under principles something like those which operated in 18th or 19th century Europe, namely under a kind of balance of power arrangement, very traditional, very historic in that sense. The analogy to the European experience of the balance of power is not exact or precise. The European balance of power rested on a continual willingness to go to war in order to forestall or correct imbalances that were felt to have appeared or were in danger of appearing. That's not the case in Asia. It's a much more subtle form of interaction and hedging, but it is directed at the same goal, which is the prevention of a dominant single actor. Now, of course, the health and the success of many of Asia's constituent countries does depend on a high degree of global engagement on their part, particularly in the economic sense. But in the geopolitical sense, again, it's the immediate region, the great difficulties that exist there, everything from transnational security threats to explicit state-to-state confrontations that exert the primary gravitational pull on the attentions of the countries involved. And here one need only really just take as an exemplar the principal strategic relationship in the region, namely that between the US and China. And I think as the US undergoes a recalibration, and as Asia comes to assume a much more totemic significance within America's overall portfolio of strategic interests, a slightly reduced America is going to feel more vulnerable and more sensitive to perceived intrusions on its sphere of influence there than it perhaps does at the present. And so there's a risk that as we go on, that the hedged engagement which the US has been practicing towards China, engaging in order to draw the benefits of China's economic rise, in order to involve it in positive ways in the management of the international system where that's possible, that's the engagement side, as against the hedge of a range of military allies alliances whose implicit objective is to not contain in a direct sense, but in an implicit sense, some of the challenges that may emerge from China. The risk that the US will fail to get that balance right, seems to me, is one that is likely to grow over time. Similarly, on the Chinese side, I think we're likely to move into an epoch now where the leadership in Beijing does feel much more confident about its accomplishments. It'll have a sense that they're less vulnerable to external shocks that might be entailed in any kind of assertion, a more assertive posture. I think we can certainly discount the line which is often peddled by the Chinese leadership, that it can claim entitlement to a kind of historical exceptionalism as a rising power. It makes this claim all the time, namely that it's studied the experiences of other rising powers in modern history and their tendency to, as they acquire greater capacities, to throw their weight around, to invite counterbalancing actions against them, to involve themselves in a variety of conflicts that then distract them from the task of economic development and lead to their eventual collapse. It may well be true that the current leadership in Beijing feels this very sincerely and strongly, but the proposition that all future Chinese leaderships will be bound by the same sensibilities is one that by definition is lacking in evidence. So it seems to me prudent to assume a more confident and a more assertive China, and if you take that in combination with an America that perhaps feels a little bit more vulnerable, you begin to see that you have in that some of the main ingredients for miscalculation and for rising to the brink of some sort of a crisis, especially if you then involve a larger scheme which refers back to the multipolarity of Asia that I referred to. If you take all of the big powers in Asia, such as Japan, India, the US, Russia to some extent, they don't have a huge amount in common, but one thing they have in common is that on the whole they are concerned about the long-term implications of China's rise. And so to the extent that the multipolar order in Asia has any organizing principle, it's one of a precautionary alignment against China. The question then becomes, how does China react to this? It has at least two main choices, it seems to me. One is to try and break out of a multipolar order in which it feels more claustrophobic and more confined. It might try to impose choices on its neighbors. It might try to exert pressure in very forceful ways. Or it could choose to, as it were, recommit itself to some of the multilateralist principles that it's been adopting over the last 25 to 30 years as an attempt to essentially reassure its neighbors about the benign implications of its rise, to give those neighbors a stake in China's success, and in doing that lay the groundwork for an acceptance of Chinese leadership or predominance, or at least a deference towards its interests over the long term. I think the problem that we will have in this regard is that China's reaction will depend on circumstance and issue. It'll oscillate between the two extremes of assertion and conciliation, and that I think makes for a much more dangerous region. All to say that it's incredibly preoccupying for the countries in that region to deal with their immediate local problems, and the idea that they will address themselves to global challenges is, I think, something that has to be cautiously considered. So the wider implications then, I think, I'll wrap up now, is just to say that this process of US retrenchment and recalibration is going to open up gaps, or if you like, cracks, in the international system as we have understood it, and that local and regional powers will have both the opportunity and the necessity to try and fill some of those gaps and to paper over some of those cracks. That will certainly suit a number of entrepreneurial, activist and ambitious regional actors such as Brazil or Turkey itself, or some of the more ambitious members of the GCC such as Qatar. It's going to be much more problematic, however, for, say, Europe. It's going to be more problematic for some of the South and Central Asian countries that neighbor, for instance, Afghanistan, who are de facto going to have to become the custodians or the stakeholders of a hopefully reasonably stable Afghan state and society that will emerge. I think at the global level, of course, the existing institutions are going to become less valid, more arthritic, less able to deal with the challenges. But I think it's a symptom of the current state of flux in which we live, that nobody else will have the capacity to essentially generate effective institutions either. And so we're likely to live in more of an age of improvisation than planning. And to turn to one particular point that Jim raised at the beginning, this whole question of a regional security architecture. Seems to me that regional security architectures, or security architectures of any variety, tend only to emerge when there's a settled distribution of power in the international system, and somebody can take the lead and act with a certain degree of authority and hopefully legitimacy to construct that. And I think that circumstance of a settled distribution of power and authority is precisely what the global system lacks now, what it seems likely to lack for the period ahead. So, welcome to the age of improvisation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.